thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I'm really excited to kick off our Fair Scholars series this afternoon with Dr. Stephen Rosales. Dr. Rosales is an associate professor at the University of Arkansas, Fayetteville, with a joint appointment in the History Department and Latin American and Latino Studies program. He holds a BA in History from the University of California, San Diego, and a PhD in History from the University of California at Irvine. So Dr. Rosales, I want to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you get started.
Well, thank you for having me, and hopefully those that watch this will be informed a little bit to some extent. This is also personal for me. I mean, the study of my community is personal for me. That's my PhD is in the field of modern U.S. West. Within that, I studied Latinos overall, but more specifically Mexican Americans. Moreover, right out of high school, I joined the U.S. Navy, did 4 years of active duty, affiliated with the reserves about 2 or so months, August of 1992. And if anybody would have told me that I'd still be in the reserves 20 some odd years later, yeah, I would have thought you were nuts. But I'm also a United States Naval officer, Lieutenant Commander, 04 Major. You might know that rank a little bit better than in the Navy, than the Navy's rank. So what I do at the U of A in the history department there, I mean, what I study, what my research is personal for me, and in terms of my community, and also in terms of the U.S. military. And so that led me to my book here. That's what, as you see here, this is the initial screen here. Soldados Razos, a rough translation, race soldiers. Soldados is literally soldiers. Razos, not quite a direct translation there, but Soldados Razos at War, Chicano Politics, Identity and Masculinity in the U.S. military from World War II to Vietnam. I've been instructed to bring in some mental health. I will do that at the very end. But I do want to give you kind of an overview as to the community's growth and its relationship and association to the U.S. military. And so this is the first big wave, not the last. And so the first big wave, roughly 1900, 1930, what is often referred to as the Great Migration. There are multiple people on the go, African Americans, right, leaving the South, going up to the upper Midwest, Northeast, what is also referred to as the Great Migration. To some extent also going out west, Ellis Island in full operation and other ports of entry along the eastern seaboard, Charleston through New Orleans, Galveston, Texas. And so history, not a series of isolated events, but history, a very powerful degree of interconnectedness, including people on the go. And so what is referred to the Great Migration from Mexico, including my great-grandparents, believe it or not, my grandmother, from which my lineage just comes from. My grandmother is born in Los Angeles, 1918. And so that first big wave, not the last, about 1.5 million, actually predates the Mexican Revolution. As you see there, point number one, it's given a push by the Mexican Revolution. And so by about 1920, 1925, you start to have what we can call a Mexican-American generation, quote unquote, an American-born group, for lack of a better word, phrasing that. The vast majority settle in the American Southwest, not all, but from places from Texas all the way to the Pacific Ocean, Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, certainly California, to a certain extent, southern Colorado. A decent percentage, give or take, some of the older Mexican-American communities are actually outside of the Southwest. The South will, the new hotspot of late is the American South, right? Latinx overall, they're heading this way, folk. Brown folk are heading this way. The Latinx folk have South on the brain. I cannot stress that enough for a variety of different reasons. Here, 100 years ago, the first big region to have a Mexican-American representation outside of the Southwest is the upper Midwest, the Rust Belt, point number 3 there. And the foundry work, the automobile industry, et cetera, all throughout the Great Lakes region, pulled a decent percentage, roughly 10-15% range you see there. The first big effort to kick back, now the effort to understand U.S. immigration history is also to understand the effort to exclude. Please understand that, the two in tandem, that is U.S. immigration history. And so if you were to ask me, I usually go by the name of Prof. Steve at my home institution. So if you were to ask me, Prof. Steve, what is the big effort to kick out Mexican Americans? Well, you see it there, second point from the bottom. My great-grandparents never naturalized, they had to leave. My grandmother did not, right? 14th Amendment, she didn't have to leave. So long as you're physically born in the US, by virtue of that physical birth in the US, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, you're born into your citizenship. So an quote unquote illegal body can give birth to a legal one, so long as that physical birth is in the US. My great-grandparents had to leave, my grandmother did not. It was 1933. She was 15, so she would have been left behind by herself and right smack in the middle of a Great Depression. So indirectly, even though she was not forced to leave, indirectly very much so, right? The context was set up that still pushed her out. And so out of a community about that time by about 3 million, the heart of it, the meat of it, it spans the whole decade, but the heart of it, the meat of it is 1931, 1935, these repatriation drives to repatriate someone, is to send them back to their perceived home of origin, in this particular case, Mexico. Some small numbers of Central Americans, especially Guatemalans, but overwhelmingly this is Mexican/Mexican American. I've read as high as millions, but the consistent number I've come across is a 500,000. So there you have it. Also labeled white, right? We have a very prominent, very powerful black-white binary in this country, right? And where do those of us that are neither fit in that binary? That's a legitimate question to ask. De jure by law, de facto social reality. My birth certificate says Caucasian, 1970. My mother's birth certificate, 1946, says white race. And when you see my mother, you see me. I don't know if Caucasian necessarily pops to mind, but we have a two-tier. We historically had up through 1970, the census of, 2 racialized labels, white or black. And in 1980, you get 2 more. Now you have 20 or over 20 now. But in 1980, you have the term Hispanic first used and Asian Pacific Islander, and then they would add in American, Asian American, AAPI, Asian American Pacific Islander, which is what it is now. But just because you're labeled something doesn't make it so. So just because you're labeled white, right? So de jure de facto, de jure, just keep that in mind for all of you that see this here in a couple of slides. De jure de facto, just because you're labeled white doesn't make it so. So de jure means by law or by legislation. De facto is social reality. So please keep all of that in mind. With regard to World War II, just some basic data up above. The only data with regard, the oldest data with regard to any one group within that Latinx category, Puerto Ricans. Because you're labeled white, no data was being kept. So the only real method to keep any kind of statistics or data was through surname, right? A Gonzalez rings loud, a Rosales, a Munoz, Martinez, that's really by surname, that's really the only way you can keep data. With regard to Puerto Ricans, however, that category has always been kept upon first acquisition, right, 1898, the Spanish-American War. So that data has been kept by the Department of Defense. With regard to Mexican Americans, has not. Moreover, also declared white, so you're serving alongside quote-unquote white soldiers. You're not, remember, we have a segregated military all the way through Korea. The first truly integrated conflict fought by the US Armed Forces is not until the Vietnam War. And so you have a black-white, or you have a black-white divide, you have a segregated US military during World War II. So roughly the consensus seems to be is roughly the guesstimate is about 500,000 of Mexican ancestry, either Mexican or Mexican American, serve in World War II, both in Europe and in the Pacific. Also right smack, I couldn't talk about World War II without also introducing the Bracero program. The Allies number over 40. Mexico joins the Allied effort and sends troops to Italy and in the Pacific against the Japanese. What many would still argue is the biggest contribution on the part of Mexico is here, the Bracero program. Brazos in Spanish denotes arms. So kind of a pun on just hard labor, because that's what in essence they did. 2 versions of the program, one dealing with agriculture, one dealing with railroad, both only meant to last for the duration of the war. The following spring of February, soon after the war ends in September of 45, the version dealing with the railroad industry does end February 46. The one dealing with agriculture is just a hit of such epic proportions with ranchers and anyone needing cheap labor harvesting crop that it lasts another 19 years until December 31st, 1964. It's like the heavens opened and down fell all these Mexican dudes. What more could you ask for, right? It was blessed and sanctioned by not one government, but by two, the US and Mexico. What more could you ask for? Wages predetermined, could not participate in any kind of activism. Literally, what more, it was the cheapest of cheapest labor internationally. So that can also be qualified as a guest worker program. 4.6 million men overall from 42 to 64. The use of the program grows. And so the clear majorities you see there, 72% in the last decade of it. In the case of Arkansas, just to throw that in there, I ran out of space. 1949 is the first batch, 50,000, and from 1949 through the end of the program, 64, about 250,000 roughly, make their way through Arkansas. And are part of the Bracero program. Some of the units that had, especially from the Southwest, that had a stronger Mexican-American presence, you see some of them there, the California 40th National Guard Division, Infantry Division, the Arizona Bushmasters were at the regiment level, Texas 36th Infantry Division, and then the New Mexico 200th Coast Artillery. And so why serve? Well, you could be drafted. Remember that, we have a draft. The Selective Training and Service Act from September 1940 through March of 73. This could be done against your will. Keep that in mind, right? You could be drafted and then the draft ends and we transition to what we now have in AVF, an all volunteer force. But that draft, at first point, will service the manpower needs for the US military for 3 conflicts, right? World War II, Korea, and then Vietnam. It would also have massive loopholes too, which I'll get to here shortly in a minute. Those loopholes don't really come don't come under any kind of scrutiny during World War II, a little bit in Korea, with those exemptions, those loopholes like the student deferment, and it's all these exemptions connected to class, really come into far greater scrutiny with regard to the Vietnam War. With that draft, for example, that the Selective Training and Service Act will also draft Elvis, right? Do you really need a draft of so-called king of rock and roll? He's over in Western Europe singing for the USO. It drafts Muhammad Ali, right? For some rather obvious reasons, I would argue. But in other words, you could be drafted. B, don't discount. I mean, for a lot of these folks, in the case of my book, I interviewed 65 Mexican-American veterans all throughout the Southwest and upper Midwest, primarily Michigan. It's your first chance at 3 square meals a day. It might be dried eggs, but it's better than not having any at all. It might be first access to actual bed for the time period, remember, for the time period. A lot of these guys are coming from inner city neighborhoods. A lot of them are coming out from out in the fields. And so the actual literal amenities provided by the US military, which are not the best at all, they're not Shangri-La, but it's better from what you came from. And so some of these guys actually gaining weight, right? When you're in boot camp, having gone through that, you lose weight because everybody's yelling at you and you're running all over the place. That you can actually gain weight is more than a little amazing throughout that whole process. And some of these guys, some of their recollections, we actually gained weight, right? Because it's the first time we actually had access to a continuous source of nutritious meals, right? And then so we actually gained weight in boot camp, which is rather amazing. You see there, right, access to doctors, nurses for some of those folks, some of these guys, that would have been the first time too. Don't discount the importance of the GI Bill, right? The GI Bill comes a little bit later, mind you. June of 1944, and there's subsequent versions after that too. The Korea, Vietnam, the Montgomery GI Bill in the 1980s, and then the post 9/11 one, 2009. So the GI Bill's evolved since the first one, 1944. The bottom points, this larger structural system of inequality that's also to some extent come under increased scrutiny in the post-George Floyd era, since George Floyd's murder, May of 2020, does have a black-white focus to it. Can I say that? Those of us that are neither black or white do have a right to say where we stand, do have a right to ask where we stand within that black-white divide, that black-white binary. And so undoubtedly, for example, for say African Americans, right, the struggle against inequality, seen and unseen, is ongoing. As it has been, pardon me, sorry. Forgot about the landline, sorry. As it has been for other groups. And this disclaimer on my part is not meant to, because I find myself doing it a bit, is not meant to in any way, shape, or form discredit, marginalize the African American struggle. It simply is an effort to expand that discussion. And then I'll leave it there. I'll leave it at that. And so double victory comes out of the Black press in World War II, right? It speaks to the desire to acquire first-class citizenship, right? You serve your country and you go overseas and you put your tush in harm's way, and then you have to come back home and sit at the back of the bus. That's not freedom and democracy, right? That's actually rather the opposite. And you have to sit at the back of the bus in uniform. There's just something inherently wrong with that. Well, that applies to other groups too. Japanese Americans interned. There's 2 internment camps in Arkansas. I remember Rower and Jerome, I believe, over in the eastern, you're in your area, they're over in the eastern side of the state. And so double victory speaks to a two-ness, a 2 victories, right? Winning the war, helping to win the war overseas, but also then bringing that service back here to the US and helping to win the war at home over racism and discrimination. And warfare, I would argue, I teach a course on military history. There is that side to me that hopefully you're starting to see now. Warfare is something exclusive, right? You just don't let anybody represent you in combat. Historically, women, slaves, non-whites here in the US. But by contrast, then warfare is something as a method toward increased legitimation, right? Warfare is a method by which you prove yourself, not just in the realm of gender, which I'll get to next, but warfare is a method by which you show a larger dominant society that is oppressing us, that, hey, we belong to. So warfare is a route to increased legitimacy. Warfare is a method in the pursuit of first-class citizenship. And right smack in the middle of all this, right, the hot summer of 43, what is known as, there's urban rioting, urban racial rioting all across the US, right smack in the middle there of World War II. The 2 that tend to get all the attention, I would argue, all of that urban rioting is black, white, including Detroit. The 2 that get all the attention is Detroit and then LA. A different dimension there out there in LA, right? The context there is white Mexican American, right? And so this is the Zoot Suit, baggy coat, some down to your thigh area, some cases down to your knee, some cases all the way down to your ankles. Creased pants, tapered at the ankle, you can barely put them on, a glob of grease, you grease back your hair, fedora hat, a keychain for your wallet up that you connect to your front pocket, and you strut the strut. You walk the walk. Very, very multicultural, right? Very, very kind of a youth subculture. Malcolm X was a Zoot Suiter. Malcolm Little, Detroit, when he was still Detroit Red, then Boston, then Harlem before he got arrested, and then joined the Nation of Islam there. But Malcolm X, white working class youth, Japanese Americans before and during the internment camps. And why I would argue why the suit maybe is a little bit more synonymous with Mexican Americans is because of the riot in LA, where there was something about the suit that angered a whole lot of folks, that angered a lot of white society at the time. It was equated with juvenile delinquency. Some were in the minority, I can't give you numbers, but not all. And also equated, once Pearl Harbor occurs and the US enters the war, it's also equated with the lack of patriotism. In other words, the Zoot Suit wasn't well received. And back home, mom and dad probably critiquing the living hell out of that too. This is something American, right? Betwixt and between. It's not Mexican there, that's something distinctly second generation. And so that you still wear it, even though larger white society is condemning you, and back home, mom and dad is critiquing the hell out of you, that you still wear it, there's the juice, there's the power for you, that you still wear it. So in other words, if you strictly focus on popular fashion, you're selling them short. I would argue that there is a politicized dimension to the suit and the wearing of it. With the Zoot Suit riots, roving bands of sailors and Marines through Los Angeles roamed through downtown LA and then hit into the Mexican/Mexican American neighborhoods. and kind of a ritualized playbook. They would beat up the Zoot Suiter. And after the riot is for 7 days, and by about midpoint in there, they just find any Mexican American, whether he's wearing a Zoot Suit or not. You rough them up, you beat them up, you strip them naked, and you're carrying straight edge razors. You shred the Zoot Suit, you pile them together, douse them with something flammable, and then you light them up. So that occurred over and over and over and over again throughout the whole week until martial law is declared by the military authorities in the region, and then they're confined to base. The soldiers, the Marines and the sailors, sorry. And so there's no way you can prove all of this psychological, right, efforts to try to read into the behavior, the action. Can't prove any of this, right? You can't prove the unconscious, the subconscious. You can't, it's kind of hard to do that. But if you're repeating a process over and over and over again, then that process means something to you. And so obviously there was something about the Zoot Suit that was triggering a hell of a lot of folks to keep repeating that process of beating up, stripping naked, shredding them, and then burning them in fire, setting them on fire, and then burning them. And so all that just kind of goes to show, illustrate rather, right? Even right smack during the war, the structural inequality present. Another factor, not to be overlooked, the role of gender. Right? The age-old equation or phrase or thought of going off to war a boy and coming back a man is as old as warfare itself. And the history, the grand arc of warfare, minimal role for females, very, 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 very masculine, which is not to say that women haven't had a role. I'm not saying that at all. But in terms of combat, very, very, very limited to men. The opportunities for females, say more specifically modern day US military, very post World War II with the whacks and the waves into the present day. And then as of last 3-4 years now, yes, 4 or 5 years, our restrictions have been removed. So females can join not only the military, but they can be anything so long as they pass the requirements. So they can be special forces, Navy SEALs, et cetera, for example, Navy SEALs, so on and so forth. In the case of Mexican American men, right, what is often referred to as martial citizenship, right, using, as I was speaking to with that second point, using warfare to politically announce yourself and claim something greater, a larger sense of national belonging, but also using warfare to solidify your status as a man. Now, masculinity, I have a class on on what I call US masculinities. I have a class on that. Masculinity is a range, it's a landscape of behaviors. Might there be a quote unquote norm in any given culture, in any given historical moment? Maybe, but it's never firmly set in stone. Think fluidity here with gender now, mind you, including what it means to so-called be a man. And so the sources of the machismo are many. This isn't just one. I have a few there right in towards the middle of the page. Certainly the Spanish, certainly the Catholic Church, certainly the US context, right? Indigenous communities, all of the above, quote unquote. So be mindful of not reinforcing stereotypes. Now, having said all of that, the bottom point, you would be remiss. Do you want to equate it with toxic masculinity? That discussion is in the air now as we speak, and for some time now, especially in the wake of the Me Too movement. You would be remiss, however, being non-white, maybe being poorer, you would be remiss if you didn't also include and examine the role of gender, masculinity, in motivating many a male, and for our purposes here, Mexican Americans, to serve from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. How monumental, how significant that role, I can't give you that. Is it a fact? Is it the factor? Probably not. Is it a factor? Sure. Yes, very much so. There, you can argue what George Mariscal calls a kind of warrior patriotism that exists within the world of the machismo. Right? He's a professor, one of my ex-profs actually, he's a professor at UC San Diego, who I think is on the verge of retiring. But anyways, he came up with that phrase. He himself is actually a Vietnam veteran. He came up with this phrase. There, bottom point, there does seem to exist a tradition of military service within the Mexican-American community that arguably is a little bit more powerful in Texas, California, where at least you have greater numbers, so therefore you can see that tradition play itself out. Not critiqued at all, critiqued very little, if at all, World War II Korea. When I get to the Chicano generation, keep an open mind. When we get to Vietnam, and so with World War II and Korea, you bring all of that together, right? The pursuit of something better socially, economically, the pursuit of first-class citizenship, the effort to try to prove yourself as a man, and also politically, you bring all that together, it could produce lack of willingness to critique anything, machismo or otherwise. With Vietnam, a whole new ballgame, right? A whole new set of concerns, a whole new political context, and a whole new movement that was willing to critique an older generation's emphasis on service, on patriotism, et cetera, et cetera. And so let me move on here. I want to introduce you briefly to this. Only further solidifies or further illustrates that structural inequality. Felix Longoria is here. That's him. He's killed in action, as you see there, June 16th, 1945 in the Philippines. He's drafted, I believe, if I remember, November of 44. His wife had moved on, was dating another guy, which was some ruckus there in South Texas. He's from Three Rivers, about 2 hours north of Corpus Christi. His wife was Beatriz. They had a little girl. The DOD does make it, has as a policy the effort to try to find bodies, the missing in action, and then send them back home. That continues to the present day. Well, they notified her in 48, right? Trying to remember, right in 48 that his body was found and coming back home, and so now she's got to find a burial site for him. She decided to settle to inter his body in Three Rivers, right? But there was one mortuary there, only one, but owned by Mr. T.W. Kennedy, and he refused. It was a segregated cemetery, segregated mortuary and segregated cemetery. So she turned to Dr. Garcia there, Dr. Hector Garcia. I'll show you a picture of him here in a second, who was an ex-BUMED, Bureau of Medicine, who served in the Army, rose to the rank of major. Hey, my rank, yeah, that's right, yeah, my current rank. And he came back, saw the plight of the Tejano Mexican-American community in Texas, and he was just motivated. She turned to him, right? She turned to him, reason why? Well, here, this is an affidavit, and word for word, I copied it here. On January 7th, 1949, I went to Three Rivers, Texas, my former hometown, to make arrangements for my husband's funeral. I went to the Rice Funeral Home, the only funeral home in Three Rivers, owned by Mr. T.W. Kennedy, to have the funeral arrangements made. He agreed to handle the arrangements, but when I told him I wanted his body kept at the chapel, he said, well, Mrs. Longoria, I have lots of Latin friends. That's an older term, right? I'm Latin. I'm not, it's fallen out of vogue and for quite some time now. I have lots of Latin friends, but I can't let his body rest at the chapel because the whites won't like it. I returned to Corpus Christi to consult with my family about the incident. One of my sisters immediately got in contact with the American GI Forum, and I authorized Dr. Garcia to get the use of the chapel for my husband's services. Dr. Garcia then called Mr. Kennedy and was told by Mr. Kennedy that they had, quote, they had never let the Latin Americans use the chapel and were not starting now, even if he was a soldier killed in action. I mean, you make the ultimate sacrifice for this country and you can't even have a dignified burial. There is something inherently problematic with that and something that is inherently un-American about that. And so she turned to Dr. Garcia. He, y'all folks, as a 33-year vet and counting, right? Oh my, I'm not supposed to get myself in trouble, am I? Some of the most intolerant spaces I've been in, can I say that? As carefully as I can? Some of the most intolerant spaces I've ever been in are our American Legion halls and Veterans of VFW halls. to the point where I just stopped. And it's just probably the best course of action. The American, you've heard of, I'm hoping that you heard of the American Legion, the biggest veterans organization out there. VFW is another, Veterans of Foreign Wars. There's two or three more, I'm forgetting their names. They have been segregated in the past. I mean, obviously not openly now, but the veteran world has been a segregated world. And so Dr. Garcia helped start the American GI Forum for Mexican American veterans, right? Because the American Legion halls and VFW halls weren't letting them in Texas and in other points in the Southwest. So the American GI Forum started up as a Mexican, it's still around, a paper tiger, not quite. I've been a member. I've been a member of the American Legion there for a while. I just stopped. I didn't renew my membership years ago. I forget exactly when. But the American GI Forum is still around. Dr. Garcia has passed here. Let me show you some. This is one of the earlier efforts to bring veterans together. Attention veterans, Gran Junta de Veteranos, excuse me, meeting of veterans, Thursday, yes, Thursday, December 30th, 1948. With the list of concerns here, right, the bonus, hospital, probably referring to the VA, the draft, schools, pension, et cetera, et cetera. That is the cover of my book. I borrowed this. That's as proud a looking bunch of Mexican American veterans as you can find. Oh, sorry. Dr. Garcia is up there on the upper right. There you go. And here he's on the far left. You looking at this. On the far right is Gus Garcia, who would kind of be his right arm. So you see soldiers, sailors, a few Marines in there. And so just kind of left with no option. They wanted to come together as veterans and agitate for not only for veterans issues, for issues as them as veterans, but also for larger issues. And obviously the Felix Longoria is a clear-cut example of racism. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. And so with Beatrice's permission, they put it to the community right there in the middle there. And the community voted, Lyndon Johnson got involved. And so the community had three options: burial, the officials, the whole local apparatus of Three Rivers, once attention was drawn to the town, as you can only well imagine, they did a whole about face. And they're trying to backtrack, yes, because obviously all the negative attention. This is a soldier killed in action who can't get a dignified burial because of, I mean, I can only imagine the stories within the African American community. I hope you understand that. I can only imagine. And so burial at Three Rivers, they rescinded their initial, they did make that offer. Burial at Fort Sam Houston in Houston, or burial at Arlington, and the community voted for Arlington. I'm sure, hopefully you've all heard of Arlington, right? Has a very powerful place. It's the oldest state, yes, of Robert E. Lee, I believe. And it's a very powerful national cemetery. And so this is his burial in February of 49. To the left there is his mother, in the middle there is his daughter, and to the right is Beatrice, his widow, and Felix in the coffin, of course. And he's buried at Arlington and has remained there ever since. And so, I don't have time, but kind of just to cut to the chase, this Mexican American generation here, post-World War II, what time is it, 4:37? This Mexican American generation here, kind of intent on not kind of knocking over the whole apple cart, but more intent on reform, a kind of politics of respectability. That term comes out of the African-American struggle for civil rights in the 50s and 60s, Martin Luther King. You're kind of appealing to white America morally, religiously. We're loyal, law-loving, law-abiding citizens. Stop segregating us, stop mistreating us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Some court cases that would use down below that would highlight the the element of race. And so in Mendes versus Westminster is out in California, using language, Mexican-American kids could be and still were segregated. And so family files of the Mendes family and a few others, it's just named after them, file a class action lawsuit. And they use the argument of race, right? Because remember, de jure, classified by law, is white. It works, they win. The school district appealed. It went up to the Ninth Circuit Court. It got upheld on appeal in 1947. Had the school district appealed again, then it would have went up to the Supreme Court. The school district stopped. Now the tricky part here, to borrow what I used to say racism, but in the wake of George Floyd, now I use anti-Blackness. When you scream and shout and rant and wave, I'm white, I'm white, I'm white, what are you implying? Right? Also needs to be asked. When you scream and shout and rant and rave, I'm white, I'm white, I'm white, what you're also saying, implying, never explicitly stated, but what you're also implying, I'm not Black, I'm not them, the Black folk. Therefore, you shouldn't, I'm white just like you. And so that is, yes, that I've never denied it. That is anti-Blackness. Now, Earl Warren, who is the Chief Justice for Brown versus Board, 7 years later, 8 years later, Brown versus Board is May 17th, 1954. Earl Warren does help shove through the California State Legislature the Anderson bill using the Mendes case as motivation. And so the Anderson bill desegregates the entire state of California, African-American kids included. Right? And so how often do you hear of the Mendes case? I'm not trying to besmirch the memory of Brown versus Board in any way, shape, or form, but how often do you hear the Anderson bill? And so Pete Hernandez is May 3rd. And Earl Warren is the Chief Justice now, 51, 52, a couple years before this. He goes from governor of California to the Supreme Court, and he immediately made, like John Roberts now, he's immediately made the Chief Justice. Like John Roberts, in the current court. The Pete Hernandez case ruled, because using Pete Hernandez as an example, they ruled that because there had not been one single Mexican American on any jury, ever, in the history of Texas. Not one, ever. Ever. And so it was taken to court, and this is where whiteness could kind of backfire. Texas came back. The Texas Attorney General came back and said, "They're white." And technically they were. They're white. We ain't segregating them because they're white. And the Supreme Court came back and said they are a distinct class of people. In other words, highlighting the de facto social reality that just because the law says they're white doesn't make it so. And so the Mendes case deals with de jure whiteness, a claim of whiteness. The Hernandez case highlights the de facto social reality of non-whiteness, and I hope that's clear. But now to move on, I'm almost there, I'm almost done. All right, this is the selective service system, right? Where the exemptions really, really come into play during Vietnam. Not so much, these were around in World War II in Korea, but they really, really start to get scrutinized. Vietnam, known as the working class war, right? The World War II, the good war, the greatest generation, working class wars is in terms of phraseology, something pretty different, right? And so in other words, the argument is that it was a system that could and did exploit America's poorer classes. Not necessarily tied to race, the argument. Now that more African Americans and other minority groups were poorer 50, 60 years ago on average, that's how you can indirectly try to link it to race, but the argument here initially is class, right? That you could navigate the system to your benefit if you were wealthier in the nation and get out of having to serve. By joining the National Guard, for example, think George W., right? In the case of Texas, Dan Quayle, Indiana. I've read an excellent study on the Indiana National Guard, 1968, right smack in the middle of Vietnam War. The average median income of the rank and file in the Indian National Guard just went through the roof, right? As the state's well-to-do joined the Indiana National Guard to get out, including Dan Quayle, and in an effort to get out of having to serve in Vietnam. The one that gets all the attention is to us, right? The student deferment. Bill Clinton, right? You could at the age, you were eligible for the draft from age 18 through 25. Once you turn 26, you were exempt. Well, if you got your BA, that's 4 years. You had to be full-time. If you went on to law school, you went on to grad school, you could get the student deferment, in other words, all the way through easily, all the way to the age of 25. Now, who's able to do that? Or wealthier classes in America. If you know Credence Clearwater Revival, yes, any of you? Fortunate Son, right, speaks to all of this, right? If you're a fortunate son, then you can get out of this. Or if you, I gotta do it. Or if all of a sudden you got bone spurs, I gotta do it. I gotta throw that one in there. If all of a sudden you got bone spurs and you never had anything and you never raised that as an issue before or after, but for that 1 year, Trump got 4 student deferments. In the 5th year, it was he got an exemption for bone spurs. I'm just told you. There you go. That the wealthy had the ability to navigate and exploit the system to their benefit. Vietnam is trickier. It's a nation divided, right? You got civil rights, you got ethnic power, you got the counterculture, you got the great boycott out there in Cali, right? Cesar Chavez. Arguably the glue that kind of brought them all together, it just seemed to a whole lot of folks that we were a big bully. So arguably the anti-war movement is huge, right? If there ever was a low point in the popularity of the US military, you could argue the Vietnam War era is it. No clear, that argument's been made by a number of different groups, African Americans and Mexican Americans. It has been made. And it was being made then specifically as a part of ethnic power, that we are being deliberately sent to, that we are being disproportionately targeted. No data that proves it. That proves a severe disproportional representation, as you see down below there. For African Americans, out of a national population of 11%, this is using the census of 1970, 13.7% of the casualties were, so that's slightly disproportionate. In the case of Chicanos, Mexican Americans, this is not from the DOD. For African Americans, it is straight from the Department of Defense. For the bottom one there, 2 ethnographers, sociologists, Brady and Faust, in 1989 did a study. Out of a national population, 4.6%. If you didn't catch the latest hot off the press news right as of 2020, and that's an undercount, white America is 57.8. This is 2020, the lowest it's ever been since 1790, the first census. African Americans, 12.4. Hispanics, 18.7. And then Asian American, 5.9. That's most recently. But here at this point in time, out of a national population of 4.6%, roughly 6% were of some type. And that's all the groups though, not just Mexico. So that would have been Puerto Rican, Mexican American, possibly also and possibly also Cuban American. And so why serve in Vietnam? Some of the same issues. Maybe your dad had served in World War II. If you are familiar with Ron Kovic's, right, born on the 4th of July from Massapequa, Long Island, that generational push would have been strong in the mid to later 60s, right? Dad served World War II, Korea. Uncle served World War II, Korea. You see John Wayne all over the place. The Duke, right? Sands of Iwo Jima, 1949. The weekly hit series Combat, 1950s through early, I think 61, 62. So, and then you got the domino theory on top of all of that, right? One country falls after the next, you have a chain reaction. So certainly a generational sense of obligation because of that. Bring all of that together. Certainly socioeconomic advancement. Certainly machismo, as I've talked about before in the case of World War II in Vietnam. However, the key difference here, as you can see with this, it's not the only illustration, but one of the more, I specifically chose this one because it's willing to think about it, right? You think about it, you're actually turning the lens around and critiquing your own community and critiquing masculinity on top of that. You're putting a big target on yourself for doing that. And so this is by Joseph Arellano, Machismo. We all know it's a quality of manhood that runs deep in our culture. We see it all around us in the courts and with authority figures. Our men never asking for a break because it runs against our grain. Machismo is expressed in our foot-stomping music, in our lusty folk songs, now in our vengeful grito, Viva Zapata, Viva la Revolucion, sorry. But perhaps it's also machismo that accounts for many of our brothers not returning from World War II, Korea, and now the war in Vietnam. So there's a clear willingness on the part of this Chicano generation. Chicana, Mexican Americans speak to the exact same thing, but Chicana is far more politicized, whereas Mexican American, I would argue, is not. And if you're using the term Chicana, you're taking a stand. I would argue a lot of that cachet is dissipated since the 60s, early 70s. But if you were taking that, if you were calling yourself Chicano back then, you were definitively taking a stand. And kind of, as with Black Power, right? How in the hell can you make me sit at the back of the bus and expect me to serve you as a country overseas in Vietnam? I think that's a valid question to ask, by the way. And in the case of, and she reviewed my book and gave me a good review. And she's still around. She's kind of one of the deans, if you will. She was a Chicana activist, Leah Ibarra. She turned academic and was forever at Johns Hopkins University until she retired. And she reviewed my book and gave me a good review. So I'm partial to her. But she's famous for a phrase, right? La batalla está aquí. The battle is here, right? With poverty, with segregation, with sitting in the back of the bus, all of the above, right? With structural inequalities. You cannot expect us to serve you overseas in battle if you can't treat us properly here domestically in the United States. And there's some valid observations there. Right? And this Chicano generation, part and parcel to the whole countercultural era there, was willing to openly make those observations, right? And it got them very much increased scrutiny. And so to start to try to wrap up here, the draft ends March of '73. We've transitioned to an AVF, all volunteer force. As of 1990, African Americans were 20% of all active duty. This is not National Guard and Reserve, just to kind of give a comparison and a contrast here a little bit with Black folk. And so as of 1990, African Americans were 20% of all active duty forces, disproportionate to their representation in society, 12.1%. Decreased a little bit, just a little bit, 19.8% as of 2020 out of a population of 12.4. For Latinos, it's been slower. In my epilogue, in the back end of my book, in my conclusion, in essence, I got this out of my conclusion, right? The Latino presence in the military has been slower to materialize, but it has begun to increase. Literally within like the last 5 years, literally, very, very, very recent. But in 1990, 4.6% active duty out of a total population of 9%. By 2020, so last year, 16.2% of all active duty forces are Latinx out of a total population of 18.7. Will surpass, the trajectory is such that we will surpass African Americans 5 to 10 years, somewhere in there, give or take. My next book, it will be the wider community with Chicanas, it's just Mexican Americans. As mentioned, this is personal for me. I'm giving my own story. The personal is political. And so I'm going to move just beyond Chicanas, Mexican Americans, to include Afro-Latinos, Central Americans, Cubans, Puerto Ricans, Latina, female. My first book, males only. This one I will include women for sure, and stronger efforts to recruit. There's got to be veterans that are members of the LGBTQ community. Undoubtedly, there has to be, I have no doubt. I will hopefully find at least a handful of them. To bring it into mental health, there's rather obvious consequences for going off to war, physical and mental and emotional. The Veterans Administration is the largest hospital system in the US, as you see down below there. You get a rating percentage. If you're claiming a disability, you get a rating percentage that starts at 10% and in increments of 10% can go all the way to 100%. It helps you to have documentation. So make sure, it would really help you to have it documented in your medical record. So then when you go to a VA office, you can take copies of that and help illustrate that. Because once you start the process, it's bureaucracy on steroids. And so whether on the left, the right, or somewhere in between, the universal displeasure From World War II, Korea, Vietnam to the present day, the universal displeasure with the VA system is massive. Yeah, you have occasional happy stories, but they are the exceptions that prove the rule. A far, far greater willingness, is it a sign of the times? Maybe a far greater willingness to be a bit more deferential toward the VA. On the part of World War II and Korean War vets, a far greater willingness to be more critical from Vietnam forward. And just to add that in the bottom, since 9/11, 20% of all discharges active duty are female. The female presence, if you're asking me, I've been in the Navy since June 26, 1988, and I'm not critiquing, I'm not critiquing. I'm just simply highlighting. If you're asking me, Prof. Steve, what's the single biggest change you've seen in 33 years of US Naval service? Females, hands down. I have no doubt it's the same way for the Marine Corps, Army, and Air Force. They were there 33 years ago, not like now. Oh, wow. I mean, explosion doesn't do it any justice. I mean, intergalactic something. I mean, it's like, wow. It's in all branches. It's in all branches, but it's in all occupations, right? Including the combat arms. Those restrictions have been removed, so long as you can pass the physical requirements. Some of the older terms. What you now know, undoubtedly perhaps have heard of, right? PTSD is in the wake of the Vietnam War in 1979. The official term becomes official in 1979. There's efforts to remove the D and just make it PTS, post-traumatic stress. Some of the older terms there are combat fatigue, shell shock. Not necessarily in the 70s, 80s, but roughly the last 20 to 25 years. So it doesn't quite help. Although if you're old, that point number 3 there, the greater willingness by the Veterans Administration to view, they need to see a missing limb historically, right? Before they give you 100% full rating or any kind of link, bigger 70, 80 percentile range or more, 100%. They need to see a missing, not missing, but a missing arm, a missing leg, right? Something physical. In the last quarter century-ish, 90s, 1990, 2000 range forward, there's been a far, far greater willingness to use mental and emotional trauma and to give 70, 80, 90, or 100%, right? And so if you're a Vietnam vet, you can constantly try to have the rating that you get, which can easily lend itself to tension, to disagreement over what rating you should get. But you can always try to improve it. And so a lot of Vietnam vets have since have since been made, maybe they're made 50% for whatever reason in 1975, 1980. And then 20 years later, 25 years later, 2000, 2005, they're made 100%. But that's only because the system was willing to give them something finally 20, 25 years later that they should have got 25 years earlier. So in other words, you've missed out on all that money because it's not retroactive. It is not. And so some of the older methods are the first 2 here with point 4, coping strategies, rap sessions is where you get together, kind of like Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, not that I know from personal experience. But you get together and you rap. So you'll be with veterans of, in the case of Vietnam, you'll be veterans of World War II, Korea. There ain't nothing like other veterans, in this particular case, there ain't nothing like other members who've undergone the same traumas as you have. In this case, warfare. You can go off to war and return physically sound, but the mental and emotional trauma of seeing death and dismembered bodies and all of the above, right, lingers with you till death. And at that point in time, it's about trying to find peace. You can certainly use drugs that leaves you like a vegetable, and still does. Some of the counseling has become better, quote unquote. You got to be mindful though of the kind of counseling you receive, because if you are still in the military, that still goes, all of that counseling you get still goes into your medical record. And so that there's kind of an unspoken code. It's better than it was. It's the best it's ever been, but there still is an informal code. There's rules to the world, written and written, formal and informal. The informal code there is you don't do it, because at a bare minimum, because all that counseling and therapy you get goes into your medical record, right? And so what a lot of guys do is then go into the civilian world, because then there might be a record cap, but it won't go into your medical record, right, as you try to seek advancement and promotions. The newest one is canine. I've seen some in my home institution here. I don't think dogs need any explanation. Yes, the beauty of a dog is pretty self-explanatory, and they're trained to, you can the backfiring of a car, a door slamming, a plane overhead, anything can trigger can trigger a reaction. And so dogs are trained. They're 14,000 a pop on average, but then dogs are trained to see that agitated state, and dogs are beautiful. I mean, dogs explain themselves, right? And they just shower you with love, and the effort there is right to calm you down. In the case of, not just Mexican Americans, but many a group, right? Just a sense of shame. You could argue also a sense of male bravado. Mexican, I've heard that phrase quite a bit, enough, not a lot, but enough. Mexicans don't go to doctors. So maybe machismo has a role to play, maybe survivor's guilt has a role to play, maybe affordability has a role to play, especially once you've left. And so to briefly try to connect it to the community at large, right? Some of the stuff I've already covered in terms of mental health, affordability, health coverage, having access to good health coverage, social communal stigma, immigrant status. Remember the undocumented, I can't give you numbers, I can't. But to speak of Mexican Americans is to speak of also Mexicans, nationals, undocumented. You can't, whether you want to hear it or not, you can't view one without the other. If you were to go to the Southwest, the Mexican American community is large. And then here in Arkansas, the Latinx community is growing 8.5% out of the 2020 census. We just saw that a day or two ago. African Americans, 15.5% out of the 2020 census. There is an immigrant, the community here in Arkansas and in the South by large is newer, more recently arrived, and there will be the undocumented there. That status as undocumented can be an impediment to wanting to go see just a doctor for a cold, right? Because you're living in the shadows of the society. Yes, as undocumented, you don't have the proper documentation, and so that in and of itself can lend can be part of a process of stigmatization. Yes, a couple of good studies that have come out, right? Just being undocumented is not good for your mental health. And if you do have other mental health issues, and in tandem with which can be exacerbated by your undocumented status, all of that can be impediment. And maybe you're poorer, that can be impediment to go seek professional help. And lack of translation services has been a documented historical issue for any Latinx community, Puerto Rican, Cuban, Mexican American, etc. Whether good or bad, that I leave to you, but the cultural familiarity that might be found with, say, a fellow Mexican American or a fellow Puerto Rican is a strong one. And if maybe you want to seek this counseling, this therapy in Spanish as opposed to English, there's nothing wrong with that. And so if you were to go to the Southwest, you can find there's a Mexican American middle class, not quite as much, not quite as strong here, like say in Arkansas. And so, for example, because given what I said earlier, right, Latinos, Latinx is south on the brain, y'all. You ain't seen nothing yet. Latinx is coming. They're coming. They're heading this way. I'm not trying to scare you, but they're brown tide rising in the South. They're heading this way, right? A whole brand new element to Southern history that historically is overwhelmingly black and white. Outside of Florida and Texas, right? I'm talking about the South in the middle there, between Florida and Texas. Brown folk are heading this way, and not the only reason why, right? Certainly agriculture, but chicken, Tyson, right? This is kind of a first one, certainly not the only chicken. But the community now really starts to begin in the 90s, mid-90s, in the wake of NAFTA. So the last 25 or so years, it's still a very recently arrived one. There's a small middle class, right? If you went to like the Southwest or Florida or the Northeast, you'd see a middle class, a professional Latinx class. You don't quite see it in the same numbers. Give it time, but when I say time, probably another generation or two. And there just isn't enough Latinx professionals, mental health or otherwise, that could also probably maybe play a role in deterring a Latinx individual from seeking mental health. And then in the case of students, right, especially for first generation, as I was, Lord knows that was undergrad, not as bad, but navigating grad school was challenging because I had one or two cousins with BAs, but I was the first of my kind. I hope you understand the significance of that. Not only just for a BA, for an MA and a PhD. And it feels like the weight of the world's on your shoulders, right? Because you're, what are you? You are a spokesperson, a symbol, a voice for the community, for not just you, but the weight of the world on your shoulders is also your family and also your community, right? Another big area where I found that was becoming an officer, right? I'm what is known as a Mustang, or prior enlisted who becomes commissioned. The further up you go, any chain of command in the military or otherwise, the further up you go, the wider it gets. Grad school, becoming an officer, were and are very white. The professorship, being a prof, were and still are very white worlds. And I feel I have the weight of the world on my shoulders. I have broad shoulders, y'all, but I do on occasion still get tired a little bit from time to time.